All right, guys, what's going on? My name is Lane Peterson. I am the wide receiver coach and new special teams coordinator at Kaukauna High School. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some practice planning, some of the stuff that I've learned over my time in college. Hopefully I can give you a couple things to be able to take on your way. Feel free to give me a follow on Twitter. I'll have all my stuff up again at the end of the video. Clip That Football on Instagram. And then shoot me an email if anybody's got any questions. Always willing to kind of help people out. So practice planning. First couple of things I do want to talk about, I'll kind of go through some of the organizational pieces of, my philosophies on practice planning, and then talk about being able to carry it from the planning period into practice, and then finish up with how you kind of enact a lot of these things during the game. So a big thing that I kind of like to start out with, and this is just the way that I think, this is kind of how, I've learned this from a few different physics and psychology type books of how to be able to, innovate and change things and be able to understand at a fundamental level what works and what doesn't work. So this is kind of the way that I think about different components, this little model that we have here. When you're breaking anything down and trying to problem solve, I always start, especially in football, the three most fundamental things that you're going to have. Judging how much time you're going to have over the course of a day, over the course of a week, even during an off season. How many hours are we going to have? How many minutes are we going to have? That's going to help you kind of budget everything out. Biggest one, especially in high school, space and equipment. So how many fields are you going to have? Are you going to have 2 fields? How many different pieces of equipment? 5-man sleds, crawler sleds, footballs even, because I know we struggle with that at practice, not having enough footballs. And then the other big one is how many people you're going to have. So if you have, a school, I'm used to being able to sit there with 2 platoons and have 100 kids at a football practice. If you don't necessarily have that, obviously your planning is going to be a little bit different. You're going to have to kind of structure that with all of the resources that you're going to have. So to me, this is just a really good place to be able to start. The biggest thing that I've probably learned over the course of my time involving, coaching football is how vital practice is. We all kind of want to talk about how important the games are, how exciting that is, but 85% of the time that you spend over the course of an entire football season is when you're on a practice field. And being able to take that time and get the most out of that, that's what's going to lead to be, really good and strong over the course of a football game. So I think that's really, really important. And the biggest way to be able to do that is prepare and plan. And a lot of these principles I've kind of swiped from different people, and I'll make sure to shout them out because I definitely want you to kind of check out some of the stuff that they have. Another big one is going to be having a shared workspace. So especially with, kind of the COVID situation, how this stuff has kind of worked through, a lot of different components are being now used digitally. So having things like Google Drive to be able to keep track of your stuff so coaches are able to complete different tasks at home, whether they're able to be at the office or not. I think this really, really helps to kind of keep things free flowing, and it allows everybody to work on things at any point in time. This is probably one of the most important things, and I think anybody at any coaching level, coordinator, head coach, you need to define what roles each person is going to have, and down to the smallest tiny little things. I remember the first year that I was at the school that I'm at, Kaukauna, I just worked as an off-field analyst. And one of the biggest things I talked about with our head coach was during our team period, we had 2 guys who didn't really do anything, 2 coaches who just kind of stood back. So we created this role definition sheet, and it's kind of organized throughout your prep work and game planning. So whether that's huddle data entry or all of those preliminary different types of components to practice. So what is each coach doing during practice? Yeah, you're going to have, the play caller, the offensive line coach who coaches the offensive line, but do you have guys that are signaling on the sidelines? Or how is all of that oriented so that way you can get the most out of all the people that you're going to have? And then the same thing can be said on game day, because I think especially throughout, high school football, there's a lot of times where you have the play callers on both sides of the ball. Maybe the head coach isn't a play caller and he's organizing like timeouts or special teams or things like that. And then you have a couple other coaches who aren't overly involved. I think it's really, really important to define a lot of those components so that way you can get the most out of all the resources that you have. So I'm going to shift into kind of the game planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about my philosophy there. Hopefully take a couple things away. So biggest components, my core beliefs in terms of game planning, is you're going to have a lot of different options There's, different types of offenses and stuff like that. Anything can work. It's just about creating a system of how it's going to be able to, right? You have guys who have been running triple for 30 years and triple still works in 2020. You have guys who swear by the spread like Alex, and then you're going to have plenty of other dudes who just work within themselves on what they do. And I think the most important part to that is identifying what do you teach, what do you know well enough, so that way you can teach your staff, and then your staff can then teach the players. So having that trickle down effect. I think the next component is going to be when you're setting up, how the team is going to work, making sure to set smart goals. So are these things that we can actually attain? Very similar to, the weightlifting and the workout training program. You want to make sure to set smart goals that are actually attainable, not just sit there and say, we're going to win a state championship or we're going to go undefeated this year. What steps can we take to reach that bigger goal? I think this is another really big one. So I grew up playing Madden 2004, Madden 2005, right? And I'd sit there and, it'd be on pro and I'd win games 60-0 or whatever, right? And I'd go into the team stats and I'd look at how I was number one in passing, number one in rushing, all the rest of it. And you go through all of those different tabs in Madden, and you're going to hit that one that sits there and says, oh, if I'm the first best scoring offense and the first best passing offense, I might not be the best rushing team. And that's okay. You have to understand that sometimes, especially with statistics, and we've reached this boom in the 21st century that stats are like the coolest things in the entire world. Like, there need to be a core different numbers that you pay attention to, that you really put a lot of merit into, and then some that maybe they're not going to. So for instance, if you want to go up tempo and score a lot of points, then your time of possession is going to be lower. And if time of possession is something that's important to you, you kind of got to weigh some of those out. So it's okay to sit there and be, really good in one category and maybe not so good in another. You just need to identify the core categories that you actually care about, and then focus just on those. Don't get too, the analysis paralysis type thing when you're looking at all of the different numbers and things like that. So kind of the second section of this, and this is probably the biggest belief that I have: overcoaching is the greatest epidemic in the sport of football right now. There are way too many guys out there, and I'm guilty of this myself. But so many coaches want to be the expert of whatever it is. An athlete comes up to you, hey, what do I need to be able to do this, right? All you got to do, put your hands up to catch the ball. Don't overcomplicate things. And I think so many times coaches it's that ego of wanting to be the expert. And again, I did this for years and years, and even still do this. Like, it's so important to be able to just break things down as fundamental as humanly possible and say, hey, these are the couple things that we need to be able to do, and not overcomplicate it. And I think that is getting better, especially in the era of simplicity and speed and no huddle and things like that. So I think that is hopefully moving in a better direction. Balance, I think that's really, really, important, and keeping guys fresh. I think that helps in a couple different ways. So number one, if you're able to substitute and keep guys fresh, it gets more guys in the field. I think the morale of your team is going to be significantly better. And again, at the high school level, it's really great to be able to sit there and rotate through 4 running backs. So like for us, we had 2 guys. We had one guy who broke his leg, one guy tore his ACL this past year. And luckily we had a third player who had sat there, and the sophomore running back had played a little bit last year. So being able to substitute and get those guys in and improve by having fresh energy, I think that's really, really important. And that is, again, something that starts during the off season. As I talked about from the beginning with like resources, looking at maybe traditional practice thoughts and identifying whether there's a huge need to them. So I raised the question, I think it was 1.5 years ago, whether is having a scout team a really, really good idea? And I actually got this idea, Coach Matt Drinkle, who's at Army. If you haven't, ever seen Coach Drinkle, like definitely a guy to check out. But he was one of the first people when he was the head coach at Kansas Wesleyan. They didn't have a scout team, right? He just sat there and said, I would rather have our best guys play against our best guys. And I'd look at the defensive coordinator and say, hey, they play a lot of cover 3, run cover 3, because then we're sitting there and going against our best dudes rather than taking, the freshman who isn't really going to make an impact, whether he's in a 4 technique or a 5 technique. That was kind of a thought that I had, and that brings a lot out of me. So that's something to kind of think about. Positional coaching. And there's actually another Drinkle thing. So when Matt was, the head coach at Wesleyan, They had one offensive line coach and one coach who coached all the skills. All the rest of the dudes were on defense. And I think that there's a little bit of a thought that each position needs to have a coach in charge of them. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case. If your quarterbacks and receivers spend all of your time together because you run a lot of bubble and that's what their indie time is spent out of, do you need to have separate guys to coach each position? Like, these are questions I think that's, especially based off of the resources that you have, are worth asking. The other one is grading players. So I know a lot of guys sit there and they create the spreadsheet, plus, minus, to kind of sit there and see whether each guy is kind of doing their job over the course of every play. I think an important part to that is, so for at Kaukauna High School, we don't have a whole lot of guys that have access to a computer all the time or go on Huddle and maybe watch enough film because they have families or things like that. So being able to identify, is that something that I need to be able to be successful? Or is it okay, given the resources that we have, that we can put that on the back burner, and this is going to be a little bit more important for us to get the most out of what we have with the people that we have. I think that's really, really important. So here's a big one, starting with data, because again, I touched on this a little bit, like data and analytics and numbers, I think, are such a big boom in the 21st century. And there's 100,000 different possibilities of what you can kind of do with it. And I think, again, identifying whatever your core components are. I want to be top in explosive plays, and I want to be able to score a lot of points. Identifying what is really important to you and staying focused on those, that's going to hopefully help you a little bit, so that way you don't encounter some of the analysis by paralysis type of stuff. This one, which I think is, probably the most underrated thing that people seek out. This is the question that I always ask anytime I talk with coaches during the off season. What's your headings group? What data do you actually care about? And I have, so one of my guys, Alex Kirby, who's a great follow on Twitter, make sure to talk to him. He talks so much about how one of the biggest things that he does when padding games is backfield orientation. So is the running back in pistol? Is he in offset? Which side is he on? And how that dictates what the play is. So finding out what categories are really important when you're sitting there and scouting an opponent, I think that's really, really good, and seeing how different coaches look at that. Last thing is going to be having an explicit method, and this goes in hand with that defining the roles for coaches. Everything that you need to be able to do, it needs to be explicitly taught, told, written down. Write down exactly what your rules are. Coach Fleck, when he was at Western Michigan, talked about having his Bronco knees, like a language. And I think that was something that I, really took a shining to, because it kind of demonstrated all of us are going to talk the same way, we're going to be the same way. And I think that type of stuff is really important, so that way you don't have differing languages. If I call something power and somebody else calls it bull or rhino, making sure that all coaches are on the same page with their terminology, I think that's going to help things go a lot smoother, because again, we're working with young athletes and we want to try to confuse them as little as humanly possible. So I'm going to roll into some of the numbers in different parts of being able to organize. So each component of a play can kind of be split up and down into 3 or 5 different situations that I would kind of look for. So you're going to have your down and distance, field position, score, time, personnel. Those are all of the things that kind of play a role in a specific play call. Again, this whole section, again, Coach Matt Drinkle at Army, one of the best that there is. So definitely take some time and research his stuff. So within those constructs, this is how I would organize your different components of what you're going to do. So you have your structure, which is going to be the tempo, the personnel, the formation, the shift, the motion. Those are components that don't have anything to do necessarily with scheme. Those are just your pre-snap labels, how you're going to organize your stuff. Then you have your run game, which can be significant, simplified down into these 3 categories: inside, outside, and option. And then pass game, which is how I would categorize as your quicks, drop back, sprint, screen, and play action stuff. That way it allows you to organize all of the stuff that you do and categorize it to figure out what you're spending the most time on. So this was a report that I ran back in our 2019 season. So I wanted to be able to figure out how many snaps we had over the course of a season for our offense. Okay, being able to break all of these down, the biggest thing with this is it allows you to identify, hey, What are we spending the most time on in practice? What are we getting the most value out of during the game? And how can we be better, maybe calling this play more or not calling this play if it doesn't necessarily work as well? So this is kind of the numbers that we had. And then if you split that down into averages, this is how our season looked. And we can kind of look at, hey, this is what we wanted to be able to do. Oh, we were at 55 plays per game. Is that enough? How can we increase this if that was based off of our core philosophies? And again, I think that's going to change depending on, whatever coaching style you really have. But these are the things that we ran, and this was how it was important to us. So when I'm looking at this and I see, okay, we have 55 snaps, if you sit there and look at 15 quick passes, then you better be practicing the majority of your time running quick passes. You better not be sitting there and running drop back for 90% of your pass plays during practice, because this is what you're running during the game. So I think this is a really good way of making your practice better rather than just focusing on your game. So we've got kind of the scheme components. I did the same thing basically for situations. So how many times are you in these situations over the course of the game? And you can split those up down in distance, field zones. You could even go a step further if you wanted to and go like, hey, score-wise, we were down here, so we needed to be more aggressive. Or this was at the beginning of the game, so we were on script. So kind of getting a feel for how many times you're in these types of situations, that will better allow you to be able to practice and figure everything out. I think this is a super useful tool. I actually got this idea from Coach Kotelnicki, who's up at Buffalo. He's got a lot of really good information on this type of stuff, and Buffalo does a really great job kind of planning what they do, and they stick to kind of their construct. They don't stray outside. They kind of focus on what they do, and they do a really, really good job with it. The big question, and I try to stay away from this a little bit, is scouting, right? So there's 1,000 different scouting, different components that you can kind of look at. But to me, the most important things are you're going to look at your personnels, you're going to look at your formations, and you really want to focus on yourself as much as possible. What do we do really, really well? And then how can we get alignment, whether it's formation or motion or things like that, to be able to get to what we do, rather than having 100 different plays because we watched last week somebody ran, quarterback throwback, and we don't have that in, but it worked against them. Let's put that in. Try to sit there and stick with your core stuff again, and being able to maybe doctor it up with a different formation or a different motion. How can we get the most out of what we have without having to wholesale change everything that we got going on? This component, just for researching purposes, I think is really, really important. So Coach Saban, when they were at Alabama, Sarkisian's first year there. So Coach Kiffin, who I actually got a chance to work under when I was at FAU, Sarkisian was an analyst there, and Sark's job over the course of the entire season, his sole focus was all he did was watch red zone film, right? So that way they would sit in on the meeting, and Sark would be the expert of just the red zone. This is what their team is going to do during the red zone. I've seen every clip over the course of the season. This is all that they do. That way you have those fresh eyes just focusing on that area. That would be something that I would recommend employing with maybe your coaching staff. So especially at the high school level, we don't have a whole lot of coaches, but we would have a red zone expert. We would have a third down expert. So those guys just focus on those specific critical areas. And that way, all of their brain power and all of their film watching is just spent on that. Maybe the coordinator handles your open play calls and, the totality of what the play calling situation is. But that way, everything is organized to the point where each of those dudes is responsible for their given area. It gives you kind of the setup to not micromanage them, but to allow them to really flourish in their roles by giving them some type of construct. So now we'll kind of get into practice, how this is kind of utilized. I'm a huge proponent of walkthroughs over film. I've talked to a few different coaches about this, and I think college-wise, this is something that's really, really trickled down from the NFL. Because the NFL, you only get 14 padded practices a year. So they don't practice a whole lot, full padded practice. And I think colleges are starting to do a lot more walkthroughs as well. So we would have, when I was at FAU, we had 3 towards the end of the season because at the beginning of the season, our Mondays were a little bit heavier, but we would have 3 basically walkthrough practices during the week and only 2 full pads. And I think there's definitely something to that, of being able to keep guys fresh. And I think kids get a lot more out of spending time walking through things on the practice field rather than sitting in a clustered group watching film on a whiteboard. The other thing I think why this is really good, especially at this time right now, is because for those of the guys that are playing during the spring, obviously COVID, it kind of hinders your ability to sit in a room and go through film. So utilizing more of that walkthrough time, I think you'll just end up getting a little bit more bang for your buck. I'll kind of go through some of the schedules that we utilized in college and some stuff that we're able to utilize now at the high school level. But again, a lot of this boils down to how many days are in our work week, how much time is going to be in our work week, how many minutes are we going to have here, and where do those minutes need to be allocated for. So when at FAU, we didn't have practices that were over 2 hours long. I know Mike Leach, who is kind of the godfather, and I'll get in a fight with people if we talk about air raid a little bit, but like he's kind of the godfather of making your practice more efficient and spending less time doing that and getting really, really good at the couple things that we're doing. And now you're seeing that kind of trickle into other organizations. So the 4 different components of each practice, you're gonna have your meetings, your film, your walkthrough, and then your full padded practice itself. So this is kind of how we organized it a little bit. So this was our first Monday. Again, during the season, we had the first 3 or 4 weeks of the year, we had full padded practices on Mondays. Towards the end, as the season is wearing on, there's a little bit more of a grind. We would go to more, no padded, slow walkthrough style practice. So you guys can kind of check this out. Hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of how everything was organized for us. This was our secondary Monday period. Once we got into like week 4, week 5, you were able to sit there and see each section that we had organized by a different special teams component. So we had first session would be our corrections from the game, the things that we needed to go through, and then you'd have your install period segregated with different special teams. And this is kind of how we organized everything. Notice it again, it's super, super short because the main focus was we want to keep guys off of their feet. We want to still allow them time to recover because we've been going for plus training camp 9 weeks, and we want to make sure that we're fresh so we don't have to deal with injuries towards the end of the year. Everybody's heavy day, Tuesday, same thing, that I think most schools are going to have. We did have these different sections out here, so you have all of your main components. We were a pretty big, we'd split up red area and third down, so this was our main red area day. And this is kind of how we would section everything out. And I really strongly believe in the philosophy of you're going to take things from your meeting to a film style session, to a walkthrough, to your individual, to a group, to a team, and then you'll put it in some type of situation. So kind of that whole part whole method. And I know there was a good video from Nick Saban in one of their meetings. I might have to find it for you. I know it's on my Twitter. But one of the biggest things that he talked about is giving kids the opportunities to learn in 5 different ways, because each kid is going to learn a little bit differently. But if you're still utilizing different techniques to be able to teach that, and then you can work on it as the day goes on, right? So we would have, if you had your core red zone plays, we would have the guys who would sit there and they would see that during the meeting. They'd work on the technique during Indy. We'd have it in group, we'd have it in team, and then we'd have it in situational. So they would get 5 chances to be able to learn that in 5 different ways over the course of, one practice. And the only way you're able to do that is if you plan everything out. So that way, hey, this is where we're going to start. This is where we're going to finish. This is how many reps we're going to have. So keeping all of that organized, I think, is really critical in a lot of these different types of aspects. We had our natural, Thursday. So a lot of guys, kind of have a little bit slower Thursday, time to recover before the game. So we had just our walkthroughs against different looks. This was full, no speed. We were just basically touching bodies and walking through different plays, again, sectioned out by special teams. And then I think a lot of guys in college, Fast Friday, high schools, I think have adopted the Fast Thursday type of principle. So everything's going to be, quick, fast movement. This practice would be probably shorter than anything else, but we would finish it by having our substitution script, which to me, this is essential for any coaching staff. I think this is so important to be able to do. And again, if anybody needs copies of this stuff, like shoot me an email or DM me on Instagram or Twitter, and I'd be more than willing to kind of share some stuff with you. But being able to go through each situation of, hey, we're in Mayday field goal and there's 14 seconds left. We don't have a timeout and the clock isn't stopped. We have to run our field goal team out. This type of situational preparedness, I think, is so critical, so that way everybody can kind of have a knowledge of what to do in a given situation. I also make sure to keep an Excel spreadsheet that has every situation that I can possibly think of, and every time I think of a new one, I write one down in there, whether it's worth doing in practice, or not at some points. I want to be able to have a planned execution of how to be able to do all of these different types of things, whether it's taking a safety, have the ball on the 10-yard line, and we don't want to score because we don't want to give the ball back. I know that's a little bit controversial, but all of those different types of things, I know for a fact, and I mean, I think a lot of schools are going to have this. I promise you that Alabama sits here and they prep for another kick six every single week because they don't want that to happen again when they lost the Iron Bowl. So being able to identify those types of situations and what could possibly happen before it gets bad, I think that's the key to really, really being able to be prepared. So how do we take all this information and then on game day, we're able to kind of utilize it and put it all together? Again, I think this starts with having defined roles, right? So how are we able to organize what's going on over the course of a game? So we have our backup quarterback who always charts. His job is standing right next to, the offensive coordinator. He charts all the plays for us. That way he's not one of the 30 kids who's sitting there and, talking about what they're doing after the game. He's readily involved and knows what happens because he's probably at the most critical position that if something happens, we need him to be able to go in. Up in the box, we have somebody who handles the role of setup coach. That one's me because I hang up in the box during games, and I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of that. And just figuring out, hey, what are we sitting here and preparing for? So that sometimes maybe it's the head coach's role of, hey, we're going to go for it on this fourth down, or are we going to punt here? Are we going to surprise onside kick? Kind of thinking through some of those scenarios. The other big one is going to be the 2-point chart. I strongly believe that every team should have a 2-point chart, so that way they should know whether it's a time to go for 2, so we're not chasing points. This is the sheet, at least right now, and again, I wholesale change a lot of different types of stuff year to year, but this is the sheet that we utilize for our team right now. I hand this to our offensive coordinator at halftime. I try as hard as I can not to give him too much to think about. That's specifically why I have that note sheet, and there's only 2 options there, because I don't want to overwhelm him with too much information. I think that's the worst thing that anybody can do, especially in game, because there's already so much tension and so much high energy going on right now. So I try to keep track of everything and make it as easy as humanly possible. So I only give 2 thoughts when we come in. I might chat for a little bit, but our head coach is very, very focused on it. Halftime, it needs to be about refocusing and teaching the kids. It can't be as much about all the coaches standing around and talking about, hey, what the heck are we going to do? And then 5 minutes, 10 minutes have gone by and no one's talked to the kids yet who are sitting there in a circle. Right? So he's a very, very strong proponent of making sure that we have our 30 seconds, our minute to be able to talk, take the information. Let's go talk to the kids and make sure that we're coaching them, getting them refocused because they're the ones that are on the field. This is another sheet. We've kind of gotten away from this one, to be honest with you, but we did keep track of this for a time where we had our drive summary. That way we would be able to analyze each drive. And to be honest, this is not something that we would give to our offensive coordinator after each drive. It would just kind of be, hey, if it's worth him sitting there, and we would have to deem this, if it's worth him knowing that, we'll pass it along. The letters there are just codes. So each of us would have a sheet, and I up top would sit there and say, hey, A is 1, B is 3. And that way we could sit there and share information a lot quicker rather than just going through the whole thing. So that's kind of how we organize that. And again, these are all sheets that I myself are sitting there and working through up in the box. Formation chart, pretty standard. This is one that I usually have almost always. It's going to be filled out before the game, so that way we know after we run our first 15, hey, this is what they're doing, coming out in 2x2 on open possession this is what we're getting. Hey, this is what we thought it was going to do, what we thought it was going to be. Hey, it's not. That way we're able to analyze, and this is probably the most important part. Did we as coaches get it right? Was our game planning, was our thought successful? Was our planning successful? Or are we completely against what we thought we were going to get? So I think this is a really good way to be able to check, hey, were we correct about this, or do we need to alter kind of our method? The final one, which I think this is going to be, as things get more simple, I think setup charts are going to kind of take shape a little bit. So you see, and again, we don't have a big enough staff to be able to do this, so I kind of handle this on my own. And to be honest, this is the one that kind of falls by the wayside a little bit because it's just hard for me to wear so many hats. But having one specific coach manned up in terms of having a setup chart. So we're a big bubble slip into, a vertical type play. So, hey, we've run bubble to the right side corner 4 times. We've got that. We're good. We can take a shot at them now. And being able to keep track of all of those different types of things, especially if you're subscribing to the simplistic method and you have a lot of your big plays, big explosives that are built off of, double moves and shorter stuff like that. I think having a coach who's specifically in charge of this is really, really good. We did just have the national championship, obviously. So you see kind of how Sark was able to play with the orbit motion and able to work off of, hey, we're throwing the ball to Devontae Smith on an orbit motion flare route. Hey, we're going to go over the top vertical after we sit there and fake that. So I think having a coach who's able to just specifically watch these components and be able to break this down, I think this would be a really good way, especially to be able to gauge, hey, are we throwing the ball, down the field enough? And are we doing it in a calculated way where we're able to sit there and take advantage? So I kind of rattled through quite a few things. Again, I'm always willing to kind of help guys out. So please make sure, kind of hit me up and let me know. The final things, just make sure, so many coaches out there are so curious about scheme, right? Hey, I want to find the new power. I want to find the new counter. I want to find the new pass play. 2 years ago, everybody was so infatuated by slot fade, right? It's really great. Now, to be honest, at the high school level, I don't think we have great quarterbacks that can throw that slot fade, but Lincoln Riley definitely can because he has Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield. So I think one of the most important things are, how can we be better at what we do, not how can we add more to our pile. So I would challenge coaches out there to kind of get curious about how can we make things more efficient, how can we make our communication better, how can we be more organizationally excellent. And I think a lot of those thoughts are thought of by a lot smarter people than me. Chip Kelly and Mike Leach were really kind of the godfathers of reinventing practice and making it fast-paced, making it simple. And I think that a lot of those techniques and thoughts, I think that would be a little bit more, you get a little bit more bang for your buck as a coach if you paid attention in some of those areas. So as I kind of finish up here, guys, again, if you need anything, please give me a shout. Always love hearing from guys. Make sure to give me a follow on Instagram. I'm sure you'll find some decent stuff there. Check out Alex's channel. Alex has got a lot of really good stuff on there. And make sure if you're not in this Facebook group, you want to hop in there too, guys. But thanks for checking me out. Hope to talk to you guys soon.